in this new story. Archived incident logs mention a remote ranger station where the final recorded footage surfaced during a massive January blizzard that cut power across several mountain routes. The footage appeared normal at first, yet investigators noted abrupt audio distortions moments before the feed ended. Locals still mention the event when storms roll through that region. Darren Morrow, a 38-year-old seasonal ranger, arrived at the station shortly after noon to prepare for worsening conditions. His assignment involved monitoring trail beacons and checking radio towers before the storm blocked access. He expected a long shift because the blizzard warning described unusually fast-moving cloud bands capable of burying vehicles within minutes. He carried a thermos of coffee, his logbook, and an old camcorder used for final checks before each closure. Snowfall increased as he hiked the short path leading to the outpost. The cabin-sized station stood on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Wind pushed against its wooden frame, which creaked with each gust. He unlocked the door, then stepped inside while his boots scattered snow across the floorboards. The air felt colder than usual, which suggested the old furnace struggled to keep up with incoming wind. He wrote a note about adding extra insulation during the next supply run. Darren began recording a standard check-in message for the regional office. The camcorder rested on a small tripod that faced the desk and radio console. As he spoke, he heard faint rattling outside, which might have been ice sliding off the roof. The footage captured him turning toward the window briefly before returning to his report. He mentioned the storm pattern shifting earlier than forecast, which matched updates from nearby stations. After finishing the recording, he stepped outside to secure loose items, since strong gusts sometimes pulled equipment down the slope. He fastened the shutters, tightened the fuel drums, and checked the tower base for cracks caused by freezing moisture. The wind cut at his jacket, which forced him to work quickly. Far below, he noticed faint lights flickering along the tree line. He assumed the lights came from hikers rushing toward shelter despite posted warnings. He tried raising nearby patrol teams on the radio, yet static overwhelmed the signal. He switched frequencies and heard fragmented voices that cut out mid-sentence. He made a note in his log about interference likely caused by atmospheric distortion. Snow began falling sideways, which signaled the blizzard center approaching faster than predicted. He retreated to the station as visibility worsened until the valley vanished behind gray walls of wind. Inside, he sealed the door and activated the exterior floodlights. The beams barely pierced the storm, yet illuminated swirling sheets of snow. The camcorder still rested on the desk, which blinked with a low battery warning. He replaced the battery, then recorded another clip describing the radio disruption and increasing wind speed. Midway through the message, the cabin door rattled sharply as if someone pushed from outside. Darren grabbed his flashlight and approached the door cautiously. He called anyone out there, but the blizzard swallowed his voice. He opened the door slightly, though the wind forced it against him. A shadow shifted near the propane tank, then vanished behind a curtain of drifting snow. He scanned the area for movement, but saw only storm waves rolling across the ridge. He closed the door firmly and logged the incident because shadows near the tank often meant wildlife searching for warmth. Minutes later, the radio crackled with a distorted tone, followed by a faint voice repeating the word northbound. The message sounded strained and clipped, as if the speaker were fighting heavy wind. Darren responded but heard no reply. He adjusted the range and tried again until only static filled the room. The camcorder recorded him staring at the console while the wind shook the building steadily. He stepped away to check the furnace since the temperature dropped several degrees. The old system clattered like metal plates shifting under strain. He opened the access panel and tapped the ductwork lightly, which helped clear condensation. A low vibration traveled through the floorboards, which made him pause. The vibration felt steady and too uniform for random wind. He checked beneath the sink and along the support beams for structural shifts, but found nothing. Outside, the floodlights flickered as if something obstructed them. The storm intensified, which caused the beams to pulse irregularly. He approached the window and saw brief flashes of orange light along the ridge. The lights moved in a slow pattern like markers following a path through the blizzard. He whispered, "No one should be out there," because the route near the ridge closed hours earlier. Darren put on his gear and stepped outside despite the punishing wind. He moved a few feet from the cabin before the storm nearly pushed him sideways. He braced himself against the railing and scanned the ridge for the orange lights, yet they faded instantly. Snow whipped across his face in dense sheets, which forced him to retreat inside. He shook off ice and placed his gloves near the furnace to thaw. The camcorder recorded him pacing between the window and radio console. The audio captured faint thumps from the roof, which sounded heavier than falling ice. He grabbed a long-handle broom and tapped the ceiling in several spots to dislodge buildup. More thumps echoed, which made him lower the broom slowly. He wrote another entry in his log describing rhythmic impacts not caused by tree limbs or loose panels. Storm pressure increased until the station walls groaned steadily. The camcorder captured a brief flicker of the lights, followed by darkness. Emergency lanterns activated automatically, which cast the room in a dim amber glow. The radio emitted a harsh frequency spike, then cut off completely. Darren pulled the backup receiver from a metal case and attempted contact again, yet no channels reached through the storm. A sharp knock hit the door, which startled him enough to step back. He called, "Identify yourself," yet only the wind answered. He approached the peephole and saw nothing except swirling white. When he unlatched the top bolt, a second, harder strike hit the frame. He shut the bolt quickly while breathing heavily. He checked the window, yet the ridge remained invisible within the storm. He reviewed the exterior camera feed connected to a small monitor near the desk. The screen showed distorted snow patterns and brief static bursts. He switched angles until one camera displayed a dark shape hovering near the propane tank. The shape moved out of frame before the feed failed entirely. He reached for his coat again, but decided against stepping outside after remembering the collapsing visibility. The floor vibrated once more as if heavy machinery operated underground. The station had no subterranean structures, which made the sensation more concerning. He steadied himself while writing in the log about the vibration lasting longer than earlier ones. The camcorder captured the moment the station lights flickered again, while a faint metallic hum filled the room. Darren turned toward the window when a sudden flash illuminated the ridge. The flash looked like a flare, yet burned too quickly to match standard emergency equipment. He moved closer until the vibration intensified. Snow along the windowsill shook loose, which signaled a stronger tremor under the cabin. He grabbed the radio microphone and attempted one final call. The transmission failed mid-sentence, which caused the radio to emit a shrill tone. The camcorder picked up the moment he dropped the microphone and reached for the breaker panel. He reset the switches, though the storm overpowered the system instantly. He shut the panel and stepped back when the knock returned to the door with a deep, hollow sound. He called out again, but received no reply. His voice cracked with fear, which rarely happened during his long years at remote posts. He prepared to secure the shutters when the propane tank outside let out a sharp pop caused by sudden pressure change. He rushed to the window, yet could not see through the frozen glass. He scraped frost away and saw faint movement near the tank, but the blizzard distorted everything into shapes he could not identify. The camcorder recorded the room shaking twice before a heavy impact landed against the wall facing the ridge. The lanterns wavered as another vibration traveled through the floor. Darren grabbed the emergency flare gun and aimed it at the door, even though firing inside would be dangerous. He backed toward the desk while keeping his eyes on the entrance. A final burst of wind slammed against the station, which caused the camcorder tripod to wobble. The camera tilted slightly as Darren shouted something partly drowned by the storm. The feed captured one last frame of him turning toward the window when a brilliant light filled the room for a split second. The video ended abruptly as the camera lost power. Rescue teams reached the station 2 days later after the blizzard subsided. They found the structure partially buried and the door forced inward by snow pressure. Darren's gear remained inside, yet he was missing. The propane tank showed signs of rapid freezing, then sudden expansion. Survey crews noted unusual ground disturbances near the ridge, though no modern machinery was found. Authorities recovered the camcorder near the desk, where it had fallen during the final minutes. Forensic review confirmed no tampering and no clear explanation for the final light captured on the feed. Audio analysis detected low-frequency vibrations matching subsoil shifts often recorded near unstable terrain, though the ridge showed no signs of collapse. Locals believe the ridge amplifies storm pressure, which creates strange lights and sounds. Some claim older tunnels exist beneath the station, built during a forgotten project, though no records confirm their purpose. Others think the flashes are atmospheric arcs triggered by intense blizzard conditions. Darren's disappearance remains an unsolved entry in the regional archive. Each January, rangers at nearby posts mention hearing faint vibrations during heavy storms. They sometimes report flickering lights near the ridge, which vanish before verification. The station still stands as a supply shelter, though it remains unstaffed during deep winter. Footage from that final night remains part of training sessions for new rangers. In those recordings, Darren's voice grows strained as each vibration grows stronger. The storm outside presses against the walls like a living presence. The video ends before any clear answer appears, which leaves viewers with the same uncertainty investigators faced. Snow still buries the ridge each winter. Wind still carves deep whirls near the outpost. Travelers who pass through the area during storms sometimes hear faint knocking carried through the cold air. Most dismiss the sound as shifting ice, though a few believe the ridge holds more than wind and snow. They mention Darren's final footage, which captures a moment where something pressed close to the station during a blizzard that erased nearly all visibility except for one last flash that no one has ever explained. In this new story, archived winter summaries across several mountain districts mention a cluster of December disappearances that occurred in remote forest corridors during severe cold snaps. None of the cases shared confirmed connections, yet the patterns unsettled investigators because each incident involved travelers who vanished within narrow windows of time and distance. Locals across distant counties traded similar warnings about isolated routes that turned unpredictable once deep winter settled over the landscape. Maeve Corbin, a 35-year-old contract cartographer, drove into one of those regions during early December while updating wildfire access maps before heavy storms closed the mountain roads. Her assignment required photographing trail markers, verifying creek crossings, and checking outdated maintenance routes. She expected a calm day because forecasts predicted only light snow with no major wind. She carried her camera bag, a roll of updated charts, and a small thermos she rarely traveled without. The forest road twisted between steep ridges where the sky looked pale and flat. Patches of ice crept across the asphalt, which forced her to reduce speed. She passed a faded sign warning that plows rarely reached beyond the next junction. A second sign hung loosely along a bent post announcing road closures from mid-month onward. She knew officials planned to block the route soon, but she needed one final survey before seasonal shutdown. After an hour, she reached a narrow turnout where a wooden information board leaned forward as if pushed by years of storms. She stepped out to photograph the area and noticed several footprints leading toward a slope behind the turnout. The prints appeared fresh, which surprised her because no vehicles had passed during her entire drive. She followed the tracks for several yards before they disappeared into a cluster of spruce where snow thickened unexpectedly. Maeve returned to her truck just as wind brushed across the ridge. She climbed back in, warmed her hands near the heater, and drove deeper along the route until she reached a rusted trail gate chained open for winter access. Beyond it, the trees grew denser while the road narrowed. She stopped again when she spotted a small backpack lying upright near a drainage ditch. The sight made her uneasy because the pack looked recently dropped. She examined the backpack carefully. Inside, she found a half-frozen water bottle, an outdated trail map, and a name tag belonging to someone who reportedly passed through the region earlier that week. Local bulletins had mentioned a hiker who turned back during a sudden snow squall, then never returned to town. The match between the name and the story sent a chill through her despite the insulated gloves she wore. She wrote the coordinates in her notebook, then scanned the surrounding woods. Snow fell lightly, which muted the forest until everything felt distant. Wind carried faint creaks from trees shifting under frost. She called out, "Anyone here?" even knowing the chances of hearing a reply were low. Her voice vanished into the branches almost instantly. As she prepared to leave the area, she noticed a strip of reflective tape fixed high on a pine trunk. The tape looked newer than the map in the backpack, which puzzled her because crews rarely mark trees during winter. She photographed the tape, then moved closer to investigate. Behind the trunk, she found a narrow footpath nearly hidden under fresh snow. The path sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. Maeve followed it only briefly because she wanted to finish her official survey before exploring more. She drove another mile until the road opened into a broad meadow where the wind carried powder across the ground in thin streams. The sky darkened earlier than expected, which hinted at an incoming front. She stopped near an old ranger's shed, leaning crookedly against a boulder. The door hung half open as if someone entered recently. Inside, she discovered a battered notebook full of field notes from a ranger patrol several years earlier. The writer described multiple strange findings across the region, including abandoned campsites, missing equipment caches, and faint tracks that vanished mid-trail. One entry mentioned hearing rhythmic knocks in a valley that appeared empty at the time. Another referred to sudden temperature drops in sheltered areas that normally stayed warm due to thick tree coverage. A gust of wind pushed snow into the shed, which made her step outside. She noticed a distant flash of movement between the tree line and the meadow. It looked like someone crossing the clearing quickly. She called out again, but received no answer. She recorded the direction in her notes because the movement matched earlier reports about people seen shortly before storms swept through. She returned to her truck and continued along the route until she reached a steep descent toward a river crossing. The radio crackled with faint static as she drove into the low ground. The river froze early this year, which formed jagged ridges of ice near the bank. She parked near the bridge, which creaked under layers of frost. The scene felt isolated enough to raise her vigilance. She scanned the area and saw a small pile of orange fabric caught in a brush cluster. She approached and found a torn piece of a high-visibility jacket. The fabric pattern matched gear often used by volunteer search teams. She collected the fragment, sealed it in a small evidence pouch, and wrote the discovery in her notebook. A trail of shallow footprints stretched from the fabric toward the riverbank, then curved sharply uphill toward dense vegetation. Maeve followed the trail, which led to an open section of forest where trees grew in uneven clusters. The air felt colder here, even though the wind paused briefly. She heard a faint, repetitive sound that resembled metal shifting. The pattern echoed irregularly, which made her wonder if it came from old equipment hidden somewhere beneath the snow. She swept her flashlight across the branches and noticed more reflective tape placed higher than typical trail markers. She recorded the placements, which formed a rough arc around the clearing. The arrangement looked intentional rather than random. She moved farther into the trees and found a narrow ravine where the snowpack appeared disturbed. Several sets of tracks converged into the ravine, though none continued beyond it. It looked as if multiple individuals descended the ravine, yet never climbed out. She crouched to examine the slope and noticed faint indentations almost hidden beneath the surface. They resembled pressure marks left by equipment pulled along the ground. She brushed away a patch of snow and revealed a rusted metal rung embedded into the soil. The rung looked like part of an old ascent ladder used during past forestry projects. She tugged on it lightly and felt a hollow space beneath. Her pulse quickened as she realized a buried structure might exist under the ravine. Old industrial tunnels or storm shelters sometimes collapsed, then filled with soil and ice. She considered climbing down for a clearer look, but the ground felt unstable. A deep vibration traveled through the slope, which convinced her to back away. The vibration lasted several seconds, then faded like a distant machine shutting down. She returned to her truck and drove toward a higher junction where she could regain radio contact. However, the snow thickened into a white curtain, which limited visibility to a few yards. The approaching storm arrived earlier than predicted, which forced her to stop near a rock outcrop. She checked her maps and found an old maintenance spur branching off the main route. She considered waiting the storm out inside her truck, but the wind intensified until the vehicle rocked gently. She turned onto the spur, hoping to reach a sheltered runoff area. Halfway up the incline, she saw a flickering light near a line of trees. The light pulsed slowly as if signaling through heavy snowfall. She thought it might be a lost hiker or a stranded motorist, so she parked and stepped out with her flashlight raised high. She moved closer and saw the light belonged to a small lantern hanging from a branch. The lantern's flame flickered erratically despite the wind. Beneath it, a message scratched into bark read, "Shelter Line West, Trail 2." She took a picture of the message because the direction did not match any current maps. Before she could investigate further, she heard another vibration behind her. This time, the sound clearly resembled metal scraping across stone. She turned to see a dark outline shift along the ridge, though the storm blurred the details. The shape moved slowly, then vanished behind a curtain of snow. She backed toward her truck, but stopped when she noticed another set of footprints near the lantern. The steps looked fresher than those near the ravine, which meant someone recently walked this route during the worsening storm. Maeve followed the footprints along the spur, which led her to an exposed slope overlooking a deep bowl-shaped corridor. The wind calmed momentarily, which gave her a clear view of the valley floor. She saw multiple patterns carved into the snow, which resembled rows of long trenches or paths created by dragging equipment. At the far end of the bowl, a faint orange glow flickered near the base of a cliff. She zoomed in with her camera and captured several photos. The glow pulsed in a steady sequence, which reminded her of security beacons or signal flares. She lowered the camera as another vibration traveled through the ground. Snow along the slope shifted slightly, which convinced her to retreat before a slide occurred. She drove back toward the main route and reached a narrow ridge where the wind finally eased enough for her to regain partial radio contact. She relayed her findings to a dispatch operator who promised to send search teams when conditions improved. She continued toward the junction when she saw a lone figure standing near a marker post. She slowed her vehicle and opened the window to call out, but the figure turned and walked toward a thicket without responding. She parked and followed on foot with her flashlight directed forward. The figure disappeared behind clusters of fir trees which bent under the weight of snow. She searched the area for several minutes until she found a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. The material matched the torn jacket found near the river, which meant she followed the same person or someone wearing similar gear. She marked the area on her map and returned to her truck as the storm thickened again. By the time she reached town, she felt exhausted from navigating through swirling ice and limited visibility. She handed her notes and photographs to local authorities who launched a coordinated search involving multiple teams. Over the next days, crews uncovered signs of old subterranean structures near the ravine and discovered collapsed ventilation shafts hidden under decades of soil. They found fragments of cold-weather clothing near one shaft, which suggested at least one traveler entered the area recently. Searchers also found pieces of rusted metal aligned in patterns that matched the long trenches Maeve captured in her photos. Engineers believed the structures belonged to a decades-old survey project abandoned after repeated cave-ins and safety violations. Thick snowfall and unstable terrain hid the remains until small shifts exposed parts during recent storms. Despite extensive searches, none of the recent missing individuals were recovered. Their tracks led toward the ravine, then vanished. Officials installed warning signs along the entire route and restricted access to the bowl-shaped corridor where the vibrations continued intermittently throughout the season. Acoustic equipment detected low-frequency pulses beneath the ground, though investigators could not confirm their source. Maeve continued her mapping work for the region but avoided the specific corridor after her report. She believed the December disappearances connected to the unstable subsurface network and shifting snow patterns that revealed and concealed pathways unpredictably. She often thought about the lantern hanging from the tree and the carved message pointing toward a shelter line no longer marked on any map. Locals still warn travelers each December about remote areas with unexplained vibrations and old structures hidden under winter snow. They recount stories about lights flickering near forgotten corridors and figures moving between trees just before storms intensify. Each tale differs slightly, yet the core remains the same. Some December nights, the forest feels alive with echoes of routes built long before current maps existed. And sometimes footsteps lead into valleys where wind and snow erase each trace within minutes, leaving only cold silence across remote America. In this new story, archived winter investigation files from 3 different counties describe a particular stretch of mountain highway where whiteouts reportedly form faster than radio towers can update alerts. The phenomenon repeats every December. It isn't marked on public maps, authorities never officially classify it as hazardous, yet everyone living within 50 miles knows exactly which section it is. Locals simply call it the Ridge, travelers call it cursed, and truckers who use the road at night learn quickly that you cannot outrun a whiteout there because the storms behave like something alive. Lennox Rourke, a 37-year-old contracted supply driver, drove that highway on a mid-December evening under a sky that looked too still for winter. The air felt heavy rather than cold, the kind of pressure that builds before storms gather but hides long enough to trick forecasters. He finished loading equipment crates onto the bed of his truck, tightened the straps twice, then checked his chains, flare kit, first aid bag, and the battery in his handheld radio. He kept a heavy thermos of coffee beside him, a habit formed after 20 winters spent hauling supplies into the mountains. He left the last outpost before dusk, following the two-lane highway into a narrow canyon where wind usually howled through rock cuts. That night, the canyon remained silent. Not a single gust, not a single shifting branch. He watched his breath curl in the cab and felt the strange stillness press against the windows like a held breath. Snow lingered in small flurries that drifted in lazy spirals. The clouds above the ridge formed long, undisturbed sheets that glowed faintly in the fading light. 10 miles up, he noticed a pair of fresh tire tracks on the snow-coated pavement. They belonged to a smaller vehicle, likely a compact sedan judging by the width. The tracks wobbled toward the outer shoulder several times before correcting. Whoever drove ahead wasn't confident on the ice. Lennox radioed a routine position update, received static instead of a response, and slowed his speed as he approached a long curve that overlooked a steep ravine. Through his headlights, he saw the parked sedan. Its hazard lights blinked weakly. Snow piled against the bumper. The driver door hung open. He pulled behind it and stepped out into a sudden gust that didn't match the earlier calm. Snow stung his cheeks. The seat inside the sedan held a thin layer of frost, as if the driver abandoned it recently. A half-written note lay on the passenger floor. It described disorientation, a strange pulsing glare over the ridge, and worsening visibility ahead. The scrawled handwriting ended mid-sentence in a long, jagged mark. Footprints led into the dense timberline, then vanished abruptly where the wind swept through the trees. Lennox called out, but only swirling snow answered. He checked the trunk and glove compartment, confirming no luggage or wallet remained. It looked like the driver fled in a panic. He radioed dispatch again, but the signal cut in and out, the interference sharp and pulsing in sync with unseen static. He continued up the highway because the research lodge needed its supplies before temperatures dropped overnight. Snow deepened quickly. He flicked on the high beams and leaned forward as he climbed another 1,000 feet of elevation. The wind returned with sudden force, carrying sheets of white across the pavement. The whiteout formed instantly. In less than a second, his world turned to blinding white. His beams reflected back into his cab like a wall of light. The road disappeared beneath swirling frost. He slowed to a crawl, searching for the faint yellow line beneath the snow. The truck groaned as the wind shoved at its side. Then he felt it. A deep, rolling vibration beneath the pavement. It rumbled through the steering column and into his arms. At first, he thought he drove over cracked asphalt, but the vibration repeated in a pattern far too regular to be natural. It felt like machinery working under the road, pulsing in slow waves. A hollow hum filled the cab, not a noise from the engine, but something distant traveling through the ground. He gripped the wheel tighter and whispered to himself that he only needed to reach the next turnout. But the storm had erased every landmark. His radio crackled violently before going silent. Even emergency frequencies fell into total static. Through the swirling white, he saw a faint glow, dim and warm like a lantern or flare. It pulsed twice, then faded. The storm swallowed it whole. He finally spotted the turnout sign half buried under wind-shaped drifts. He turned into it and killed the engine. The moment the truck stilled, the world fell silent, except for the soft hiss of snow against the windows. The vibration beneath the ground returned, stronger this time. He stepped out and instantly felt the storm slam him sideways. Snow whipped across his vision in chaotic bursts. Still, he saw it again, the distant lantern-like glow flickering far down the ridge, swaying as if carried by an unsteady hand. He raised his flashlight and followed the glow. Each step sank past his ankles. The wind roared so loudly he barely heard his breathing. The lantern glow brightened, then dimmed. When he reached the ridge edge, the wind paused, just briefly, revealing a trail of fresh footprints descending into a narrow gap between two boulders. He followed the prints to a sheltered clearing, where the wind died completely. There, he found a metal service box half buried in ice. Its door hung open, clinking softly in the breeze. Inside, a flickering emergency lamp illuminated piles of old engineering logs scattered across the snow. He brushed frost off one page and read that decades ago, crews tried stabilizing the ridge after discovering deep fractures extending several miles beneath the highway. Some fractures reportedly produced heavy vibrations during cold snaps, others echoed with humming noises long after construction equipment shut down. One engineer wrote that whiteouts triggered surface shifts powerful enough to knock tools off tables. Another recorded flashes of color during storms that turned the snow blue for a moment before fading. None of the entries ended optimistically. The project halted after a series of unexplained injuries. The final pages contained abrupt, shaky handwriting as if recorded in haste before crews evacuated the area. The wind returned violently, slamming the service box door against its hinge. Snow blasted across the clearing, burying the footprints behind Lennox in seconds. He attempted to climb back to the turnout, but the storm collapsed around him. The whiteout erased all shape, all direction, all sense of slope. The vibration beneath the ground grew into a steady pulse. He dropped one knee into the drift, bracing himself. Then the light appeared again, this time brighter, bluish, and closer. It flashed once, then again. It illuminated the storm like lightning flickering inside a closed room. He shielded his face as the vibration stopped abruptly, leaving a deep ringing in his ears. When the storm eased momentarily, he recognized the outline of his truck barely 30 yards uphill. He pushed through the drifts and climbed into the cab with shaking hands. His headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. And then something struck the back of the truck. Not a rock, not debris, something heavy enough to shift the entire chassis. He looked through the rear window but saw only churning white. When the dash lights returned, he noticed new tracks behind his vehicle footprints moving in a staggering, uneven pattern. They circled the back of the truck twice before stopping abruptly at an untouched drift. No exit trail. No continuation. Just sudden absence. The radio crackled violently. A voice broke through for half a second, a woman screaming a word he couldn't understand. The signal collapsed again before the dispatcher came through, faintly asking for his status. Lennox forced his voice steady as he reported everything he'd seen. She ordered him to return immediately. The descent felt endless. Whiteout pockets still erupted at random, swallowing the world in sudden blindness before releasing it again. Snow reflected his taillights in ghostly red bursts. The mountain behind him pulsed with silent flashes he could not explain. Only when he reached the lower forest line did the storm finally weaken. Search teams reached the abandoned sedan the next morning. The seat still held a thin layer of frost. The driver never returned. No prints remained except deep indentations captured in early photographs. A team located the service box clearing and retrieved the logs, confirming chronic seismic anomalies beneath that stretch of highway. Several log entries matched the timing of Lennox's report almost exactly. But the most disturbing discovery came from the audio files engineers recovered from Lennox's malfunctioning radio. Buried beneath the static, analysts detected irregular pulses matching the tremor pattern of underground shifts too deep and too rhythmic to be caused by ordinary geological movement. Locals still warn travelers never to trust the ridge's calm skies. They say the whiteouts there do not behave like normal storms. They arrive instantly. They vanish instantly. And sometimes, during the brightest flashes, they reveal silhouettes of things standing where no person could stand. Some claim to hear humming beneath the tires just before the visibility collapses. Others swear the snow glows blue right before the tremors begin. Lennox refuses to drive that highway now. He told investigators he can still feel the vibration in his bones when he thinks about the storm. And he still dreams about the footprints appearing behind his truck, circling twice before ending nowhere, as if something walked there only long enough to watch him through the snow. He knows one thing for certain. On that mountain highway, you cannot outrun a whiteout. Not because it moves fast, but because it feels like the storm is already waiting for you the moment you decide to climb the ridge. And once the wind closes, there is no direction, only white, only echoes, and only the sense that something beneath the road finally woke up. A dispatcher noticed an odd pattern during the blizzard. The winter of 1988 brought a storm that locals still talk about during every single heavy snow alert. Records from the county dispatch office show that emergency calls tripled within the first 4 hours of the whiteout conditions. Silas Vance was 42 years old and worked as a senior dispatcher for the rural Mountain Valley Emergency Services. He had spent 12 years answering phones, but nothing prepared him for the chaos of that specific Tuesday in January. Silas arrived at the station before dawn, while the first flakes were just beginning to cover the dark asphalt roads. His goal for the shift was simple, since he just wanted to keep the radio channels clear for the plows. The wind picked up around 10 o'clock, and visibility dropped to near zero across the entire northern half of the valley. The first strange call came through at noon from a woman who reported a stalled sedan on a back road. She told Silas that she saw a man in a red jacket walking away from the car toward the woods. Silas logged the location and sent a deputy, but the officer found the car was empty and completely locked up. The deputy reported that there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle despite what the witness had just claimed. Silas assumed the snow had simply filled the tracks in quickly because the wind was gusting at 40 miles an hour. An hour later, another call arrived from a different part of the county regarding a man in a red jacket. This witness was an elderly farmer named Arthur, who claimed he saw someone standing in the middle of his field. Arthur said the figure was not moving at all despite the freezing temperatures and the blinding sheets of heavy snow. Silas checked the map and realized this farm was nearly 15 miles away from the first sighting of the sedan. It was impossible for someone to travel that distance on foot through a blizzard in such a short amount of time. The dispatcher began to feel a sense of unease as he looked at the blinking lights on his console screen. He decided to pull up the digital logs from the previous winter storms to see if this pattern had appeared. Dispatchers often share stories about ghost calls or strange sightings during heavy weather, but Silas usually ignored that kind of talk. He noticed a note in the archives from 1983 that mentioned a red jacket near a frozen creek bed. The similarities were enough to make him sit up straight and reach for his cold cup of black morning coffee. A third call interrupted his thoughts when a local gas station attendant reported a silent person standing by the pumps. The attendant described the individual as wearing a bright red coat that looked far too thin for the sub-zero weather. Silas asked the caller to approach the person, but the attendant refused because the stranger was behaving in a way. The person supposedly turned toward the shop window and just stared with an expression that the caller described as empty. When the deputy arrived 5 minutes later, the parking lot was empty and there were no signs of any visitors. Silas started plotting these points on a paper map of the valley to see if there was a physical connection. He used a red pen to mark the sedan, the farm, and the gas station while checking the exact times. The points formed a perfect straight line that cut across the most dangerous and uninhabited parts of the rugged mountain. This line did not follow any existing roads or hiking trails, which made the speed of the sightings even more. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows of the old dispatch center building office. He reached out to a retired dispatcher named Vance who had worked in the valley for over 35 years. Vance listened to the description of the red jacket and stayed silent on the other end of the phone line. The older man finally whispered that Silas should look at the logs from the Great Blizzard of 1972. Silas searched the basement archives and found a dusty folder containing handwritten notes from a very long night in December. He found a report about a missing surveyor who vanished while wearing a distinctive red parka during a record storm. The surveyor was named Elias, and he had been tasked with marking the boundary for a new high-voltage line. According to the old dispatch logs, Elias had sent a final radio transmission about getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Search teams looked for him for 3 weeks, but they never found a single trace of his gear or body. The line Silas had drawn on his map matched the exact path of the proposed power lines from that era. Every sighting from this afternoon was located at a spot where a massive steel utility tower currently stood in silence. Silas realized the figure was not walking between the locations, but was appearing at specific points along the electrical grid. He received one final call as the sun began to set behind the thick gray clouds of the dying storm. A homeowner near the end of the valley reported a man in a red jacket standing on her back porch. She said he was tapping on the glass and holding up a surveyor rod as if he were taking measurements. Silas told her to stay away from the windows and dispatched the nearest unit with a sense of urgent dread. The deputy reached the house in record time but found only a pile of snow leaning against the wooden door. There were no boots prints on the porch, and the homeowner was hiding in her bathroom with a loaded shotgun. Silas looked at his map one last time and saw the final point ended at the local main power substation. He called the utility company to warn them, but the technician said the gates were locked and the alarms silent. The storm finally broke around midnight, and the wind died down to a soft whistle through the frozen pine trees. Maintenance crews went out the following morning to clear the ice from the heavy lines near the primary mountain substation. They found a vintage surveyor rod leaning against the fence and a scrap of red fabric caught in the wire. There was no body found in the drifts, and no evidence that anyone had climbed over the high-security fence. Silas kept the scrap of fabric in his desk drawer as a reminder of the pattern he found that day. He never spoke about the red jacket again, but he always watched the monitors closely whenever the snow started falling. The valley remained quiet for the rest of the winter, and the strange calls did not return to the station. Experts say that sensory deprivation during blizzards can cause groups of people to imagine similar things out of thin air. Silas knew the difference between a tired mind and a factual log of events recorded in real time on paper. He retired 3 years later and moved to a coastal town where it never snows and the sun always shines. The records of 1988 remain in the basement for the next person who might notice the strange pattern. The county museum eventually displayed a small exhibit about the surveyor who disappeared so many long decades ago in the cold. Visitors often stop to read the official reports from that night, and they wonder about the man in the red coat. Some believe that the energy from the high voltage lines acted as a conduit for a soul lost in time. Others think that the extreme weather simply bends reality in ways that the human mind cannot ever fully understand or explain. The dispatch office still uses the same map system, but the younger workers do not know about the red ink. Silas spent his final days sitting on a porch by the ocean while reading books about geography and local mountain history. He often thought about the surveyor Elias and hoped the man finally found the boundaries he was looking for that night. The red fabric in his drawer eventually faded to a dull pink, but the memory of the tapping glass remained. He knew that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by police officers or by professional search and rescue teams. The blizzard of 1988 remains a legend that grows larger every time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The station logs were digitized in the year 2010, but some of the original handwritten notes were lost during the process. Silas had made sure to photocopy the most important pages before he left the valley for the very last time ever. He sent those copies to a historical society so that the truth of the pattern would not be forgotten by history. The surveyor rod found at the substation remains in a glass case as a silent witness to a very strange afternoon. No one has seen the man in the red jacket since the power grid was upgraded in the early 90s. The wind still howls through the mountain passes, and the snow still buries the small towns under feet of frozen white powder. Every dispatcher who sits at that desk now hears the faint static on the radio during the height of a storm. They look at the screens and they watch for any calls about a man walking alone where no man should be. The legacy of the red jacket is a part of the valley now, and it will be for a long time. Silas Vance died peacefully, knowing that he had documented the impossible with the steady hand of a true professional worker. The strange events linked to a winter motel. The isolated stretch of highway leading toward the northern peaks remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the territory. A single automated security camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a roadside motel. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the vacant parking area. Local law enforcement rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant incident or a missing traveler was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in January of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 42-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy snow. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the motel. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle alone. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed, and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something was dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the time and the place. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the car. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The Winter Motel was now clear of the mystery, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time, one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. Final footage from the camera reportedly showed that the suspects had used the motel as a temporary landmark for their activities. Witness statements gathered later mentioned a white sedan frequenting the area during the hours after midnight when the highway was empty. Dispatch logs confirmed that no service calls had been placed from that vicinity for over 48 hours before the find. The investigation concluded that the thieves had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the northern border by the end of winter. This case remains a prominent example of how routine data maintenance can expose secrets hidden in plain sight for years. The recovered items were documented in archived calls between the museum and the Regional Recovery Task Force as being priceless. Silas often thinks about the moment the progress bar reached 100% and the thumbnail first appeared on his screen. The cold air of the mountain pass still carries the memory of that day when a machine captured the truth. He continues to maintain the network of cameras with a diligence that ensures no detail is ever truly lost. The forest remains quiet now, but the record of the Winter Motel is preserved in the Regional Safety Archives. The story of the stolen artifacts serves as a reminder of the historical significance buried within the small mountain towns. Students now visit the museum to see the displays that were nearly lost to the black market forever. The regional board implemented new protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Silas is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Silas knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look closely. The mystery of the Winter Motel is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. The warning, hidden in a camper's last dashcam footage. The presence of a dashcam often provides the only objective record of what occurs when a person disappears into the wilderness alone. In many cases of missing hikers and campers, the final frames of footage contain subtle details that authorities originally missed during the initial search. A small silver vehicle was found abandoned at the end of a Forest Service road in the spring of 2022. Inside the car, a dashboard camera was still plugged into the power port, despite the battery of the vehicle being completely dead. Lyle Hendricks was a 48-year-old freelance photographer who specialized in capturing rare nocturnal wildlife in the high desert. He arrived at the remote canyon entrance on a Friday afternoon with the simple goal of setting up his motion cameras. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and Lyle expected to stay at his campsite for at least 3 nights. He carried a professional-grade camera bag and enough water to last for several days in the dry heat of the canyon. The landscape was rugged and filled with deep sandstone cracks that could easily hide a man from the view of a helicopter. As Lyle drove his truck along the narrow dirt path, he noticed a series of strange markings painted on the rocks. He followed the winding road until he reached a flat clearing where the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. The dashcam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect the area before the sun began to set. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the brush near the base of the cliffs. He returned to the truck and checked his GPS unit before realizing that the signal was fluctuating wildly for no reason. He sat in the driver's seat and the dashcam captured a strange humming sound that seemed to be coming from the ground. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind that day. Lyle reached for his radio to call the park dispatch office, but only static came through the small speakers of the unit. He found a piece of notebook paper and wrote a quick note about a light he saw reflecting off the canyon walls. The handwriting on the note was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle parked had been the site of several unexplained disappearances since 1975. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple campers reported seeing figures that moved without making any sound at all. Search teams arrived at the clearing 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but found no signs of a struggle or injury. They found his camera equipment sitting on the ground, but the memory cards had been removed from every single device in his bag. Lyle picked up his dashcam and realized it was the only piece of hardware that still had a recorded file on it. The photographer had decided to keep the dashcam running through the night to capture any movement in front of his truck headlights. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the internal microphone picked up a rhythmic clicking. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the vehicle one last time to investigate the source of the noise. He walked toward the edge of the clearing and disappeared from the frame of the dashcam as the clicking sound grew louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume turned up. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a metal door latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the canyon floor. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any hiker they had seen. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a danger approaching from the hills. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden behind the thick clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in the same sector. Lyle Hendricks reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer to his car. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the clearing that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of fine cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the undercarriage of the abandoned truck. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange biological mechanism. The camper whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high beam lights of the truck. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the clearing would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Hendricks had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep canyon crevice while hiking. However, the details on the dashcam suggested that the camper was being actively hunted by something that understood how his technology worked. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped recording at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of a person. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver truck. The final few seconds of the video contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the lens from the outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the surrounding air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the cave system he had photographed earlier that same day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the car alarm being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black, without any more images of the canyon or Lyle. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage of the camera. A technician named Silas Vance examined the digital files and confirmed that the footage had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the clearing together to look for the cave system Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the sand that contained a series of sketches and a broken lens. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged canyon floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray, translucent skin. Silas noted that the broken lens had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Hendricks had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been here since 1900. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dashcam footage remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Hendricks often thinks about the quiet photographer and the warning he tried to leave behind for others. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who carry cameras. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The clearing remains empty and avoided by locals, but the dashcam still holds the final warning of 2022. The missing tape, found inside an abandoned ranger station. In the late summer of 1984, a local hiking group discovered a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. The structure served as an old ranger station that the forestry department had officially decommissioned over 30 years before that day. Inside the dusty main room, they found a single magnetic tape sitting on a desk next to an empty lantern. The reel was thick with grime and appeared to have been untouched since the mid-20th century was still in its prime. Silas Vance was a 32-year-old land surveyor who spent most of his weeks mapping the rugged terrain. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of marking the western boundary lines. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his work before the sunset. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying tools and a large thermos of coffee to keep his energy levels high. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and ancient decaying wood. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of pine trees, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a wooden fence. He followed the timber line until he saw the silhouette of a small building perched on a rocky limestone ledge. The windows were boarded up with gray planks, and the front door hung slightly open on its rusted iron hinges. Silas stepped onto the porch and felt the floorboards groan under his weight as he moved toward the dark interior. He noticed that the structural integrity of the cabin was failing as the roof sagged under the weight of moss. He pushed the door open and noticed a strange scent of old paper and copper hanging heavy in the air. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, but the desk in the center of the room looked surprisingly clean. Silas approached the desk and saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting ready as if someone just stepped away. He found a small black cassette tape resting beside the machine with a handwritten label that simply said August 4th. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a hand that was shaking with fear. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific station was a man named Elias Thorne in 1950. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his weekly radio check-ins without any prior warning. Search teams combed the surrounding hills for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing Forest Service employee. Silas picked up the tape and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire building. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man named Elias. The surveyor decided to bring the tape back to his office to see if the recorded audio contained any clues. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to hear the voice of the man who had vanished so long ago. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for a compatible player to listen to the old magnetic reel. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering lights of the old theater. Silas eventually found a working player at a local thrift store and connected it to his desk speakers that evening. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. A voice that sounded tired and strained began to speak about a series of lights appearing in the northern valley. The man on the recording claimed that the lights were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft. He spoke with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer of the natural mountain world. The narrator described how the lights would hover over the tree line for hours before disappearing into the deep mountain lakes. Witness statements from 1950 mentioned similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the floorboards of the station. He believed that something was living beneath the cabin and was using the radio antenna to broadcast a strange signal. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass jars on the shelves to vibrate and crack. Silas listened closely as the recording captured the sound of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the ranger station. Elias stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the heavy breathing of a man. The ranger whispered that he could see eyes reflecting the moonlight through the gaps in the wooden boards of the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from the town, and they did not look like any animals he knew. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the shingles on the roof with great speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from isolation and wandered off. However, the details on the tape suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his safety. Silas paused the audio and looked at the date on the tape, which was the day before Elias went missing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tapping on the recording was getting much louder. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the ancient wood of the isolated mountain station. The final few minutes of the audio contained a frantic description of the cabin being surrounded by a bright blue light. Elias shouted that the humming sound was vibrating the glass in the windows and making his ears bleed from the pressure. He mentioned that he was going to hide the tape in the desk and hoped that someone would eventually find it. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic crash and the sound of the wind rushing through the open station. Silence filled the room of Silas as the tape continued to spin without any more recorded sound or voices. Silas contacted the local historical society the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned woods. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the tape and confirmed that the voice matched the old radio logs of Elias Thorne. They returned to the site of the ranger station together to look for the hidden compartment Elias mentioned on the tape. The forest seemed different under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal box buried under the floorboards that contained a series of photographs and a silver ring. The photographs showed blurry images of metallic objects hovering over the very trees Silas had walked through just the day before. One image captured a tall figure standing in the shadows of the porch with elongated limbs and very large dark eyes. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any language. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply disappeared, but had been documenting an encounter that defies any logical explanation. The symbols on the ring seemed to glow faintly when the men brought it into the direct sunlight. The authorities reopened the case, but the physical evidence remained the only proof of what happened on that August night. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger station and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for others. The tape serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are buried in the woods for a very good reason. He no longer surveys that section of the forest because the low humming sound still echoes in his quiet dreams. The station remains empty and forgotten by most, but the tape still holds the secrets of 1950. Every time Silas looks at the jagged peaks of the mountains, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost forest ranger. He kept a copy of the tape in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to play the audio. The researcher Marcus Reed moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the station on the limestone ledge and the lights that still appear in the valley. Silas knows that the truth is recorded on that thin magnetic strip hidden inside the drawer of his wooden desk. The missing tape found inside an abandoned ranger station. In the late summer of 1984, a local hiking group discovered a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. The structure served as an old ranger station that the forestry department had officially decommissioned over 30 years before that day. Inside the dusty main room, they found a single magnetic tape sitting on a desk next to an empty lantern. The reel was thick with grime and appeared to have been untouched since the mid-20th century was still in its prime. Silas Vance was a 32-year-old land surveyor who spent most of his weeks mapping the rugged terrain. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of marking the western boundary lines. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his work before the sunset. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying tools and a large thermos of coffee to keep his energy levels high. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and ancient decaying wood. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of pine trees, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a wooden fence. He followed the timber line until he saw the silhouette of a small building perched on a rocky limestone ledge. The windows were boarded up with gray planks, and the front door hung slightly open on its rusted iron hinges. Silas stepped onto the porch and felt the floorboards groan under his weight as he moved toward the dark interior. He noticed that the structural integrity of the cabin was failing as the roof sagged under the weight of moss. He pushed the door open and noticed a strange scent of old paper and copper hanging heavy in the air. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, but the desk in the center of the room looked surprisingly clean. Silas approached the desk and saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting ready as if someone just stepped away. He found a small black cassette tape resting beside the machine with a handwritten label that simply said August 4th. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a hand that was shaking with fear. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific station was a man named Elias Thorne in 1950. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his weekly radio check-ins without any prior warning. Search teams combed the surrounding hills for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing Forest Service employee. Silas picked up the tape and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire building. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man named Elias. The surveyor decided to bring the tape back to his office to see if the recorded audio contained any clues. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to hear the voice of the man who had vanished so long ago. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for a compatible player to listen to the old magnetic reel. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering lights of the old theater. Silas eventually found a working player at a local thrift store and connected it to his desk speakers that evening. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. A voice that sounded tired and strained began to speak about a series of lights appearing in the northern valley. The man on the recording claimed that the lights were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft. He spoke with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer of the natural mountain world. The narrator described how the lights would hover over the tree line for hours before disappearing into the deep mountain lakes. Witness statements from 1950 mentioned similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the floorboards of the station. He believed that something was living beneath the cabin and was using the radio antenna to broadcast a strange signal. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass jars on the shelves to vibrate and crack. Silas listened closely as the recording captured the sound of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the ranger station. Elias stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the heavy breathing of a man. The ranger whispered that he could see eyes reflecting the moonlight through the gaps in the wooden boards of the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from the town, and they did not look like any animals he knew. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the shingles on the roof with great speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from isolation and wandered off. However, the details on the tape suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his safety. Silas paused the audio and looked at the date on the tape, which was the day before Elias went missing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tapping on the recording was getting much louder. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the ancient wood of the isolated mountain station. The final few minutes of the audio contained a frantic description of the cabin being surrounded by a bright blue light. Elias shouted that the humming sound was vibrating the glass in the windows and making his ears bleed from the pressure. He mentioned that he was going to hide the tape in the desk and hoped that someone would eventually find it. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic crash and the sound of the wind rushing through the open station. Silence filled the room of Silas as the tape continued to spin without any more recorded sound or voices. Silas contacted the local historical society the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned woods. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the tape and confirmed that the voice matched the old radio logs of Elias Thorne. They returned to the site of the ranger station together to look for the hidden compartment Elias mentioned on the tape. The forest seemed different under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal box buried under the floorboards that contained a series of photographs and a silver ring. The photographs showed blurry images of metallic objects hovering over the very trees Silas had walked through just the day before. One image captured a tall figure standing in the shadows of the porch with elongated limbs and very large dark eyes. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any language. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply disappeared, but had been documenting an encounter that defies any logical explanation. The symbols on the ring seemed to glow faintly when the men brought it into the direct sunlight. The authorities reopened the case, but the physical evidence remained the only proof of what happened on that August night. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger station and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for others. The tape serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are buried in the woods for a very good reason. He no longer surveys that section of the forest because the low humming sound still echoes in his quiet dreams. The station remains empty and forgotten by most, but the tape still holds the secrets of 1950. Every time Silas looks at the jagged peaks of the mountains, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost forest ranger. He kept a copy of the tape in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to play the audio. The researcher, Marcus Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the station on the limestone ledge and the lights that still appear in the valley. Silas knows that the truth is recorded on that thin magnetic strip hidden inside the drawer of his wooden desk in this new story. Archived travel notes from cold region patrols mention a winter road exit where visitors reportedly vanished during heavy storms each January. The incidents share subtle similarities, which led locals to warn travelers about taking that route after dusk. No official conclusion ever linked the area to crime, which kept the road open despite unsettling reports. Clara Haldren, a 34-year-old wildlife survey assistant, drove that road during a mid-January evening as she returned from a remote tracking station. She planned to reach her lodge before nightfall since blizzard warnings suggested dangerous winds by midnight. Her assignment involved recording migration data, which required several hours in snowy terrain. By late afternoon, the sky turned darker than expected, which convinced her to take the faster exit toward the valley. The road narrowed as she approached the turnoff, where a leaning sign barely remained visible through swirling frost. Patches of wind-carved ice stretched across the asphalt, which forced her to slow her truck. She noticed tire marks moving toward the exit, despite local warnings posted on bulletin boards in nearby towns. She had heard stories about sudden whiteouts that formed without warning near the valley, but she never experienced one herself. Clara turned onto the exit, which dipped into a hollow between tall ridges. Snow absorbed nearly all sound, which gave the empty road an unnerving stillness. Her headlights caught glimpses of broken guardrails, which suggested others had struggled with the sharp curves. She breathed slowly while gripping the wheel because something about the air felt heavy. She checked the clock and noted she still had enough time to reach her lodge if the weather held. A faint flash reflected in her side mirror, which made her glance backward. For a moment, she thought she saw another vehicle, but nothing followed her. The hollow deepened until the ridges blocked the last hints of daylight. She continued carefully while her radio crackled with static. She tried adjusting the frequency, but the distortion grew louder until she shut it off to preserve concentration. As she neared the midpoint, she saw an overturned snowmobile lodged against a half-buried mile marker. She stopped her truck and stepped out into wind that bit through her jacket. The vehicle looked recently abandoned, which meant someone had been traveling this route despite community warnings. She called out anyone out here, but her voice faded quickly into the storm-filled air. She examined the snowmobile and found a torn glove caught near the ignition. Fresh footprints trailed away from the scene toward a gap in the ridge. The steps looked uneven, like the person stumbled repeatedly. Clara debated searching farther, but darkness pressed in fast, which made her decide to continue driving and report the discovery later. She returned to her truck, but before she could start the engine, a dull mechanical hum drifted across the hollow. The sound came from deeper along the road, which confused her because there were no structures nearby according to regional survey maps. She started the engine and followed the route slowly until she saw a faint orange light blinking in the distance. The light remained steady as she approached a wide bend where snow piled high along both shoulders. At the bend, she discovered an abandoned road maintenance trailer with its hazard beacon still running. The trailer door hung open while snow drifted inside. Her breath caught as she realized the beacon could not have lasted long in such cold conditions. She approached the trailer and saw scattered tools on the floor, including a cracked radio handset. A notebook lay half buried near the wheel, with entries mentioning repeated signal interference along the exit. As she flipped through the notebook, she found a page describing faint vibrations in the ground during certain storms. The writer mentioned hearing muffled clanks like large metal parts shifting beneath the road. Clara frowned because no underground structures existed in this region except old drainage channels long since collapsed. A sharp gust of wind slammed the trailer door, which made her jump. She returned to her truck and continued driving because the storm intensified rapidly. Snow fell so heavily it appeared as a wall of white ahead of her headlights. She slowed to a crawl and kept both hands tight on the wheel as she followed the faint curve of the asphalt. The ground trembled lightly beneath her, which reminded her of the notebook entry. She dismissed the idea because she believed the wind caused the shaking. A shadow crossed her headlights, which made her hit the brake. A lone figure stood near the shoulder, wearing a winter suit covered with frost. Clara rolled down her window slightly and called, "Do you need help?" But the figure remained motionless. She stepped out cautiously and walked toward them with her flashlight held steady. When she reached the figure, she saw the suit was empty. It hung on a crooked pole that had been planted in the snow. A small handwritten tag on the collar read, "Do not follow the lines." The message unsettled her because it sounded like a warning written in haste. She turned back toward her truck when the ground vibrated again. This time, the tremor felt rhythmic, like machinery running beneath frozen soil. She knelt and placed her hand on the snow, which gave a slight pulse. Her breath quickened as she looked around the hollow, now swallowed by dense, blowing snow. She hurried to her truck, but before she could enter, she heard a deep, metallic shift to the east. The sound carried through the wind like a massive gate sliding along rails. She could not see anything past the storm, but she sensed movement in the valley. She entered the truck and locked the doors while trying to think clearly. Her headlights flickered as if something interfered with the electrical lines. She tapped the dashboard, then noticed faint lights appearing ahead on the road. They flickered irregularly, like small beacons activating in sequence. The lights formed a line that guided toward a narrow pass between the ridges. Clara refused to approach that direction because locals frequently reported strange sightings near that pass. She reversed slowly while trying not to lose traction. The lights brightened briefly, then faded until darkness returned. The vibration beneath her truck continued for several minutes before stopping entirely. She took this brief calm to turn around on the narrow road, which required precise steering due to steep snowbanks. As she maneuvered her truck, the beam of her headlights crossed a collapsed service gate near the slope. She had not seen this gate earlier, which meant either snow covered it before or something triggered a shift that exposed it. She walked closer and found tracks leading inside a shallow service tunnel cut into the ridge. The tracks appeared similar to those from the abandoned snowmobile. She snapped several photos and backed away because the chemical scent of old fuel drifted from the opening. She returned to her truck, hoping to escape before the storm worsened. As she drove upward, the ground vibrated again, though softer this time. She kept her focus on the road until she reached the valley rim, where wind cleared some of the snow. From this angle, she saw faint glimmers below which matched the blinking beacons earlier. She paused briefly because the pattern formed straight lines that cut through the hollow in unnatural alignment. The moment she looked down, a loud clank echoed across the valley, which made her flinch. The beacons vanished instantly, as if someone shut them off in unison. She accelerated toward the main road while gripping the wheel tightly. The exit curved toward safer terrain until she reached an old ranger turnout. She parked beside the shelter and caught her breath. Inside the shelter, she found outdated emergency logs describing similar winter vibrations recorded years earlier. One entry mentioned a collapsed engineering project that attempted to construct a hidden supply tunnel during a past decade. The project was abandoned due to repeated cave-ins and unreported injuries. After reading more, she realized the collapsed network sat directly beneath the exit she had traveled. She left the shelter with a deeper understanding of the hollow. The underground structure might have partially remained intact, which explained the vibrations and moving air currents. Yet the functioning beacons and shifting patterns suggested someone continued to monitor or access the network despite its unstable condition. Clara reported everything to regional authorities after reaching her lodge. Investigators visited the exit days later when the storm cleared. They found the snowmobile missing along with the abandoned maintenance trailer. Only scattered tools remained frozen into the ice. The pole with the empty winter suit had fallen into a drift, and the tracks near the service tunnel had vanished under fresh snow. Survey teams detected slight subsurface cavities below the hollow, which matched remnants of old industrial tunnels. They also documented faint metallic debris buried deep under compacted snow, which suggested past attempts to reinforce underground sections. No modern machinery was found, which left the source of the vibrations unresolved. Locals continued to warn travelers about that exit each winter. They claimed the hollow changed during storms. Some believed shifting pressure reopened parts of the underground network. Others thought an unknown group used the tunnels secretly during harsh weather. Travelers who ignored warnings sometimes reported lights moving in patterns along the valley floor, though no proof ever surfaced. Clara kept her distance from the exit after that night. She felt certain someone maintained parts of the collapsed network. The beacons and rhythmic tremors convinced her the hollow remained active during storms. The winter road exit still cuts through that valley and remains open each January, despite repeated warnings whispered in nearby towns where people remember the old project and the long, silent tunnels that still breathe beneath the project. Snow. This final voicemail from a highway turnout still has no explanation. The discovery of a mobile phone at the edge of a steep embankment changed the direction of a major search. A local road worker found the device while clearing dry brush near a remote highway turnout in the late autumn season. The battery was long dead, but the internal storage remained intact and contained a single recording that baffled the local authorities. It was a 3-minute voicemail left on an answering machine that seemed to document a very strange and sudden disappearance. Lyle Vance was a 42-year-old long-haul trucker who had spent his career driving through the high desert. He arrived at the mountain pass early on a Tuesday night with the simple goal of resting before his final delivery. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Lyle expected to finish his route well before the sunrise. He carried a heavy thermos of coffee and a small notebook to record his mileage and fuel stops for the company. The highway was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of sagebrush and cold engine oil that night. As Lyle pulled his heavy silver truck into the paved turnout, he noticed a series of strange lights in the sky. He followed the flickering glow with his eyes until he reached the very edge of the gravel shoulder near the cliff. The dash cam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect a noise coming from the rear of the trailer. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the rocks near the base of peaks. He returned to the cab and checked his radio before realizing that the signal was dropping out for no clear reason. He sat in the driver's seat, and the internal microphone captured a strange humming sound that seemed to come from above. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind there. Lyle reached for his phone to call his wife and leave a quick message about the delay in his scheduled return. The voicemail began with him explaining that he saw a group of figures walking across the empty highway in the dark. His voice was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or a deep growing fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle stopped had been the site of several unexplained events since 1974. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that multiple drivers reported seeing shadows that moved without making any sound on the road. Search teams arrived at the turnout 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but they found no signs of struggle. They found his truck idling with the door wide open, but the keys were missing from the heavy metal ignition switch. Lyle left his phone on the dashboard, and it was the only piece of hardware that had a recorded file. The trucker had decided to keep the call active even when he realized that no one was picking up the phone. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the microphone picked up a rhythmic. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the truck one last time to investigate the bright glow. He walked toward the edge of the turnout and disappeared from the range of the cab lights as the clicking grew. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several long weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working player and watched the final 30 minutes of the video file with the volume up. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the mountain pass. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the walk of any human being. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn his wife about a sudden light. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the pavement even when the moon was hidden behind the clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mention similar shadows being seen by a group of tourists in the same mountain sector. Lyle Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from starting his truck and leaving now. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the side mirrors to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the aluminum panels of the trailer. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a mechanism. The trucker whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high-beam lights. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the fuel to run out so the turnout would be in darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the cab with great mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Vance had originally concluded that he likely suffered a medical event and fell. However, the details on the phone suggested that the trucker was being actively followed by something that understood his equipment. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of man. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the frame of the heavy truck in the quiet night. The final few seconds of the voicemail contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the window from outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the air. He mentioned that he was going to try and hide the phone so that someone would eventually find the record. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the truck horn being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black without any more images of the mountain pass. The sheriff contacted the state police the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage. A technician named Silas Reed examined the digital files and confirmed that the audio had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the turnout together to look for the notebook Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the gravel that contained a series of sketches and a ring. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged highway. One image captured a figure standing in the middle of the road with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Silas noted that the silver ring had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been there. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the phone remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Vance often thinks about the quiet trucker and the warning he tried to leave for them. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who drive. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The turnout remains empty and avoided by locals, but the phone still holds the final warning of 2020. Every time Silas drives past the mountain pass, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost trucker on that old phone. He kept a copy of the report in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to read it. The technician, Silas Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the highway pull-off and the lights that still appear over the mountain peaks. Lyle knew that the truth was recorded on that small device hidden at the edge of the steep drop. Today, the highway is monitored by new cameras that do not require a man to sit in a cab in dark. The turnout is paved with fresh asphalt, and the state has removed the old signs from the high mountain sector. Silas Vance spends his time working in the valley where the lights of the city keep the shadows away. He still wonders if the clicking sound he heard on the phone was a message or just the sound of time. The mountain wind continues to blow dust against the truck stop while the memory of the driver fades into history. Some things are not meant to be recorded by a man who is just trying to get home to his family. Lyle Vance left his voice behind to tell a story that the desert tried to bury in the rocks long ago. The phone remains the only witness to a night that ended with a flash of light and a cold room. He is gone, but the recording continues to play for those who are brave enough to listen to the truth. The high desert is a place of long shadows and deep silence that can swallow a man and truck. We may never know what Lyle saw through the glass of the truck, but we have his voice to guide us. The warning is there for anyone who finds themselves alone in the dark near the old mountain highway in the sand. He was just a driver doing his job when the world changed and the lights came down from the sky. The routine ended, but the story of the recording will live as long as the memory of the turnout. The truth is still out there, waiting for the next person to pull over and look into the dark trees. The silence of the high desert is never truly empty when you listen to the static on the old radio bands. Silas Reed still looks at the stars and wonders if Lyle is out there looking back at the bright city. The silver ring sits in a velvet box and refuses to lose its strange and cold glow in the night. The investigation is over, but the mystery of the highway turnout will never be solved by the men on Earth. It is a story that belongs to the wind and the stars and the man who left his phone behind. We are all just travelers on a road that leads into the unknown parts of the vast and empty world. Lyle Vance was the first to find the secret, and he will not be the last to see the light. The highway remains open, but the turnout is a place where the shadows move with a life of their own. Listen to the wind when you drive through the mountains, and you might hear the clicking sound of the desert. It is the sound of a secret that has been kept for a very long time by the old rocks. The story of Lyle Vance is a reminder that we are never truly alone, even in the most remote places. The final voicemail is a bridge between our world and the one that exists just beyond the reach of lights. We should be careful where we choose to rest when the sun goes down and the desert starts to speak. The light is beautiful, but it carries a price that some men are not prepared to pay in the end. Lyle paid that price, and his voice is all that remains of his long journey through the dark mountain pass. The road goes on forever, but some drivers never reach the end of the line because of the lights. Keep your eyes on the road and do not look too long into the shadows of the high desert. The truth is there, but it is hidden in the static and the clicking of the old magnetic tapes. Silas Vance knows this, and that is why he stays in the city where the lights never go out. The mountain is waiting for the next truck to pull over and listen to the humming in the air. Be safe on the highway and remember the name of the man who tried to warn us all that night. The story of the missing trucker is a tale that will be told as long as people drive. There is no explanation for the voicemail, but there is a lesson in the silence that follows the loud click. We are just small parts of a much larger mystery that is unfolding every night in the dark woods. The highway turnout is a doorway, and Lyle Vance was the one who walked through it into the unknown. We have the recording, and that is enough to know that the desert is alive with a strange power. The mystery remains, and the world continues to turn while the stars watch over the empty and quiet road. Silas closes his eyes and hears the voice of his friend calling out from the distance of the stars. The end of the story is just the beginning of a much larger journey for those who are taken. We will wait for the next sign and hope that we are ready for the light when it comes. The highway is long, and the night is deep, and the secrets are many in the high mountain pass. Be careful where you stop, because you might not be the only one looking for a place to rest. The voicemail is the only thing that is left of a man who saw too much. It is a warning that we should all heed when we find ourselves alone on the road. The truth is out there, and it is waiting for the next recording to begin in dark. Silas Reed knows the truth, and he will never return to the highway turnout in the desert. The story is finished, but the mystery will live on in the hearts of those who listen. Lyle Vance is gone, but his voice will never be forgotten by the people who find the phone. The desert has spoken, and the recording is the final word on the matter of the lights. This security footage was reviewed years later. The grainy black and white pixels of an old security tape often hide more secrets than they reveal to the naked eye. Digital archives from the mid-1990s show that most regional storage facilities only kept footage for 30 days before recording over it. Silas Vance was 62 years old and worked as a consultant for a private archival firm specializing in cold cases. He had spent his entire career looking for the small details that other investigators missed during the initial chaos of a crime. Silas arrived at the climate-controlled warehouse in the autumn of 2024 to review a box of labeled tapes. His goal for the week was to digitize the final records of a defunct shipping company located in a remote valley. The air inside the vault was dry and smelled of old magnetic tape and the faint scent of ozone from the machines. The first strange clip appeared on a tape labeled 17 January 1988 at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning. It showed the perimeter fence of a loading dock during the height of a historic blizzard that had paralyzed the entire region. Silas watched as a man in a thick jacket walked slowly past the camera while carrying a long metallic surveyor rod. The man did not look at the lens, but he moved with a strange mechanical rhythm that seemed to ignore the wind. Silas paused the frame and tried to sharpen the image, but the snow was too thick to see a face clearly. He logged the timestamp and moved to the next reel, which covered a different camera angle on the opposite side. An hour of footage went by before the man appeared again on a camera located 3 miles away at a substation. This witness footage was captured only 10 minutes after the first sighting, which made the distance traveled physically impossible for anyone. Silas checked the map of the facility and realized the terrain between the two cameras was a steep and icy ravine. It would take a team of professional climbers hours to traverse that gap, even in the best possible summer weather conditions. The figure in the red jacket stood perfectly still in front of the high-voltage transformers for exactly 60 seconds total. He appeared to be taking measurements of the air itself, while the transformers sparked and glowed with a strange blue light. The investigator began to feel a sense of heavy dread as he realized the figure was not a standard trespasser or thief. He decided to cross-reference the footage with the dispatch logs he had discovered in a separate file from that era. Silas found a report from a dispatcher named Vance, who had noted a similar pattern of sightings during that same storm. The logs mentioned a man in a red jacket appearing at various points along the regional power grid in a straight line. Silas felt a chill as he realized the footage he was watching provided the visual evidence for these legendary ghost calls. He reached for a notepad and began to map out the coordinates of every camera that had captured the strange figure. A third clip showed the man standing on the roof of the main warehouse, looking out toward the dark mountain range. The camera was mounted 20 feet high, and there was no ladder or staircase that led to that specific vantage point. The figure held the surveyor rod high above his head as if he were trying to catch a signal from the sky. A massive flash of lightning illuminated the entire frame for a fraction of a second, and the man simply vanished into air. When the light faded, the roof was empty, and the only thing moving was the snow blowing across the flat surface. Silas replayed the segment 10 times, but he could not find any evidence of a jump or a hidden door. Silas started comparing the visual data with the original surveyor blueprints for the valley that were drawn in 1972. He used a digital overlay to match the positions of the man with the planned locations for the utility tower foundations. The points on the video matched the blueprints with a margin of error of less than 1 single inch of space. This line did not follow the actual towers that were built, but followed the original path that was later abandoned. Silas felt his hands shake as he realized the figure was following a ghost map of a project that never existed. He realized the man was Elias, who was the surveyor who had disappeared during the Great Blizzard of 1972. He reached out to a contact at the State University who specialized in electromagnetic anomalies and the recording of historical events. The professor listened to the description of the blue sparks and the surveyor rod, and he stayed silent for a long time. The academic finally suggested that the heavy snow and the high voltage lines might have created a natural recording of the past. He explained that certain materials can act as a permanent storage medium for human energy under the right atmospheric pressure conditions. Silas looked back at the screen and saw the man in the red jacket tapping on a window in the background. The tapping was silent on the tape, but Silas could almost hear the rhythmic sound echoing through the empty warehouse vault. The final reel of the collection showed the interior of the dispatch office during the transition of the morning shift change. Silas saw a younger version of himself sitting at the console while staring intensely at a paper map on the desk. In the reflection of the glass window behind the young Silas, he could see the man in the red jacket standing. The figure was not inside the room, but appeared to be standing in the reflection as if he were watching. Silas froze in the frame and realized the surveyor was looking directly at the map and pointing to the final substation. This footage had never been reviewed by anyone because the shipping company had gone bankrupt shortly after the storm of '88. Silas realized the figure was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but was a loop of time caught in wire. He received a final notification from the digitization software that the last tape had been successfully processed and stored in cloud. A technician near the end of the warehouse reported a strange humming sound coming from the old tape player in the corner. She said the machine was unplugged, but the reels were spinning at a high rate of speed while emitting blue light. Silas told her to leave the room immediately, and he locked the door to the vault with a heavy iron key. He looked at the monitors one last time and saw the red jacket standing in the middle of the warehouse aisle. The archival firm finished the project, but they decided to redact the specific timestamps of the man in the red jacket. They found a vintage surveyor rod hidden behind a false wall in the basement during the final sweep of the building. There was no explanation for how it got there or why the metal felt warm to the touch in winter. Silas kept a single screenshot of the reflection in his wallet as a reminder of the man who stayed behind. He never returned to the valley, and he stopped working as a cold case consultant shortly after the project ended. The tapes were destroyed in a controlled fire to prevent the loop from spreading to other modern digital recording systems. The mystery of the 1972 surveyor remains an unsolved file in the dusty cabinets of the local sheriff office. Experts say that the footage was likely a double exposure caused by the age of the magnetic tape and the heat. Silas knew the difference between a technical error and a man trying to find his way back to the main road. He lived the rest of his life in a house with no mirrors and no windows that faced the north side. The memory of the red pixels remained as a factual record of a night when the past became the present. The blizzard eventually ends, but the patterns we leave behind in the static never truly fade away from the world. What happened in this roadside motel was never reported. Local police files from 1996 contain a series of strange reports about a motel on Highway 8. Most of these official documents were never released to the public because the findings were considered too strange for print. Lyle Thorne was a 42-year-old insurance investigator who specialized in finding high-value missing property. He spent most of his life driving through rural counties and staying in places that most people would usually avoid. One rainy Tuesday in October, he was looking for a place to rest after a long day of tedious work. The Sunnyside Inn sat on a quiet stretch of road that felt far away from any major town or city. Lyle pulled his sedan into the gravel lot and noticed that the neon sign was flickering in the dark woods. There were only two other cars parked in front of the long row of identical blue doors near the office. He checked into room 14 and paid the elderly man at the desk with $20 in crisp cash. The room smelled like old cedar and industrial cleaner, which was common for these types of cheap roadside lodging houses. Lyle set his briefcase on the desk and decided to record his daily notes before he went to sleep tonight. He turned on his portable tape recorder and started describing the mundane details of his latest insurance claim in the city. A sharp, metallic scratching sound coming from behind the wall made him stop talking in the middle of a sentence. He looked at the thin floral wallpaper and realized the sound was moving slowly from the ceiling toward the floor. Lyle walked over to the wall and pressed his ear against the cold surface to hear what was happening inside. He heard a soft, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heavy heart beating against the wooden frame of the building. The investigator decided to walk outside to see if there was any maintenance work being done on the exterior wall. The gravel lot was completely empty, and the two cars he saw earlier were now gone without making any sound. He looked at the window of room 15 next door, but the heavy curtains were shut tight against the night. Lyle walked back into his room and noticed that his tape recorder was still running on the small wooden desk. He picked up the device and rewound the tape to see if the scratching sound had been caught on audio. When he pressed play, he did not hear his own voice or the scratching sounds from the thin motel walls. Instead, he heard a recording of a man and a woman having a very quiet conversation about a hidden basement. The voices on the tape sounded like they were standing right next to the microphone in the empty motel room. Lyle checked the recorder for any signs of tampering, but the device was exactly where he had left it earlier. He knew that his recorder had not been out of his sight since he entered the Sunnyside Inn that evening. The woman on the tape mentioned that the floorboards in room 14 were the only way to reach the stairs. Lyle looked down at the stained brown carpet and felt a chill go down his spine in the quiet room. He moved the heavy desk aside and peeled back a corner of the carpet to see what was underneath it. There was a small brass ring attached to a square piece of plywood that had been cut into the floor. He pulled the ring, and the wooden hatch opened with a loud groan that echoed through the small guest room. A narrow set of concrete stairs led down into a dark space that was not visible from the outside. Lyle grabbed his heavy flashlight from his briefcase and began to climb down into the hidden area beneath the motel. The air in the basement was cold and dry, which felt very different from the humid October air outside. He shone his light around the room and saw shelves filled with hundreds of small black boxes and white envelopes. Each box had a date and a room number written on the side in faded black ink from past years. Lyle reached for a box labeled 1984 and found a collection of personal items and Polaroid photos inside. There were driver licenses and wedding rings and small toys that looked like they belonged to families who stayed here. He realized that none of these items were mentioned in any of the local police reports he had ever read. He found a ledger on a nearby table that listed names of guests next to a column titled Final Status. Most of the entries in the ledger ended with the word processed, which made Lyle feel a deep sense of dread. He heard the sound of the blue door to room 14 opening directly above his head in the quiet motel. Lyle turned off his flashlight and crouched behind a stack of wooden crates to stay hidden in the thick darkness. He heard heavy footsteps walking across the floorboards and then the sound of the carpet being pulled back again. A bright beam of light shot down into the basement as the elderly manager peered into the dark square hole. The manager was holding a long iron bar, and he started to climb down the concrete stairs with slow movements. Lyle saw the man stop at the bottom of the stairs and look directly toward the crates where he was hiding. The manager whispered that he knew someone was down there because the ledger had been moved from its original spot. Lyle waited until the man turned his back, and then he bolted for the stairs with every ounce of energy. He scrambled up the concrete steps and pushed past the manager who tried to grab his leg in the dark. Lyle reached the guest room and ran out the front door into the pouring rain without looking back at all. He jumped into his car and drove toward the nearest town until he found a gas station with bright lights. He called the county sheriff from a payphone and explained that he had found a hidden room at the motel. The sheriff arrived 30 minutes later and followed Lyle back to the Sunnyside Inn to investigate the strange hidden basement. When they arrived at the property, they found that the gravel lot was empty and the neon sign was dark. The office was locked and the manager was nowhere to be found when the sheriff knocked loudly on the door. They entered room 14 and pulled back the brown carpet, but they found nothing but solid subflooring and old nails. There was no brass ring and no wooden hatch and no sign that a hidden basement had ever existed there. The sheriff looked at Lyle with a look of deep suspicion and asked if he had been drinking that night. Lyle pulled the small black box from his jacket pocket to show the officer the evidence he had taken earlier. He opened the box, but instead of jewelry or photos, it was filled with nothing but gray dust and dirt. The sheriff told Lyle to go home and get some rest before he decided to file a false report charge. Lyle drove away, but he kept the tape recorder in the passenger seat as he headed toward the next city. He pressed play on the device to hear the mysterious voices one last time before he reached his own house. The tape was completely silent for several minutes until a new voice started speaking at a very low volume level. It was his own voice, but it was describing the basement and the ledger in the past tense, like history. The recording ended with the sound of a heavy wooden hatch closing and a brass ring hitting the floorboards softly. Lyle looked in his rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights following him at a very long distance behind. He realized that the things he saw in the motel were never meant to be reported to the local authorities. The Sunnyside Inn was torn down 2 years later to make room for a new highway expansion through the county. Construction crews found nothing unusual in the soil, and no records of a basement were found in the city archives. Lyle Thorne moved to another state and stopped working as an insurance investigator shortly after that strange night in October. He never stayed in a roadside motel again for the rest of his life because he feared the walls. Some stories are better left in the dark where they cannot be proven or recorded by the light of day. The truth about Room 14 remains buried under miles of hot black asphalt and the silence of the deep woods. This isolated church has a long history. The historic stone chapel, located on the high ridge of the Northern Valley, remained a silent witness to the local history. A heavy oak door stood in the darkest corner of the eastern transept to protect the original property deeds and maps. This facility was a critical link for the Parish Heritage Board because it provided the only physical evidence for the building. For 70 years, the archive operated without a single major incident until a Friday in November of 2022. On that day, the building recorded a sequence of structural shifts that defied every known engineering model used by the office. Lyle Vance was a 46-year-old historical preservation officer who worked for the regional government during that busy year. His primary job involved reviewing the weekly building reports to ensure the foundations remained stable against the shifting mountain groundwater. Lyle enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the hidden corners of the town buildings. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of ancient stone. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific vibration sensor was experiencing a strange recurring calibration error. The descent took nearly 10 minutes as the air grew colder and the dim lights flickered over the damp walls. Lyle reached the end of the hall and connected his diagnostic tablet to the monitoring port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the data logs were almost full of movement alerts that should have been ignored by the software. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of seismic readings taken during a recent light rain. Lyle decided to download the final batch of sensor data before he cleared the memory and reset the internal hardware. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the event logs to ensure the equipment was anchored. He saw the familiar baseline readings and the small spikes caused by the passing of heavy trucks on the road. One log from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the pressure signature looked different from the data around it. A massive weight had been applied to the internal side of the sealed wall just past the edge of the frame. The sensor recorded a steady push that lasted for exactly 5 minutes before the entire system went dark for a second. Lyle felt a slight chill because that section of the church was known for being a completely dead zone for signals. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the building had shifted again during the night shift. The pressure was still there, but the sensor reading was now pulsing and a low-frequency hum stood near the frequency. The force appeared to be originating from deep beneath the floor, and it was pulling something heavy out from the dark. Lyle zoomed in on the digital waves until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating vibration. He checked the timestamps and realized that the event had been at that specific location for less than 10 minutes total. The third log showed the pressure dropping back to zero and leaving nothing but a flat line in the file. Lyle looked toward the actual wall in the corner and saw that the mortar seal was still perfectly intact today. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished now. The air was stagnant, and the only sound was the hum of the ventilation fans echoing through the empty corridor. The floor was dry from the recent summer heat, and he noticed thin cracks in the stone where the wall met. He followed the line for about 5 feet until he reached a small gap hidden behind a stack of metal shelves. Lyle found a heavy iron latch tucked under a layer of thick dust and cobwebs that looked intentionally placed long ago. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy bolt was sealed with industrial wax. A faint smell of sulfur hung in the heavy air, and Lyle immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He used his portable radio to contact the main office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious architectural anomaly today. Within an hour, 2 structural engineers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with bright orange plastic tape. They asked Lyle to show them the sensor logs on his tablet so they could identify the source of force. The engineers noted that the hidden hallway did not have a registered blueprint in any of the municipal archive books here. They carefully scraped the wax on the latch and discovered several rusted ventilation pipes from a forgotten early 20th century. The local museum had reported a missing set of original town founding documents 3 months earlier, but the police had nothing. These papers were extremely valuable, and a former clerk had likely hidden them in the wall until the investigation closed now. The engineers realized the thief must have used the old vault room to hide the stolen property behind the wall. They analyzed the sensor data from other units along the foundation to track the path of the subtle structural shifts. This lead eventually took them to a small residential house located 2 blocks over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more documents that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a collector to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former janitor who knew exactly how to access the sub-basement without triggering alarms. He did not realize that the new vibration sensors were set to record every movement regardless of the weight or size. His simple mistake of leaning against the hidden latch had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. Lyle returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details today. Most people would have deleted the error logs without looking at the data because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the thief, and the original deeds were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the municipal buildings and always looked a little closer at the logs from the basements. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The hidden latch still stands in its dark corner and records the passage of time 1 minute at a time now. It sits behind the metal shelves and the occasional staff member who travels through the silence of the lower levels. No one ever suspects that a simple sensor could be the most important witness to a crime in the building. Lyle knows that every data log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look today. He walks the halls with a new perspective and watches the digital monitors for anything else the system catches. The federal investigation into the document theft revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the market. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the property rights of many local families. The recovery of the original land survey maps ensured that several ongoing legal disputes could be settled with accurate evidence. Lyle received a formal commendation from the mayor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire valley community. He often shares the story of the hidden hallway with new preservation officers as a lesson in professional diligence. The quiet church stands on the hill and continues to serve the families as it has for many generations now. Visitors admire the architecture and the stained glass windows without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the floor. The story of the vibration sensor and the iron latch has become a local legend among the town residents today. Most people walk past the oak door in the transept without realizing its significance in the history of the parish. For Lyle, the sound of the wind against the limestone will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The truth about what happened on that Friday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of the Quiet Valley continue their lives while the mystery of the church hallway hangs over the town. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Lyle continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm today. The silence of the basement is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The archives of the town recorded the passage of time as the seasons changed from the heat of the summer. The limestone walls of the old chapel remained strong against the wind that blew across the high ridge of the mountain. Lyle often looks at the digital feed from the sensors on his tablet while he sits in his quiet office. He knows that the history of the town is safe as long as someone is willing to watch the data. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The structural engineers completed their final report on the hidden corridor and the forgotten vault room in the sub-basement. They found that the original construction had been modified several times during the early part of the 20th century. These changes were never added to the official maps of the town or the blueprints of the historic limestone chapel. This lack of information provided the perfect hiding place for someone who wanted to keep a secret in the dark. The discovery of the iron latch was a turning point in the investigation into the missing regional property deeds. The former janitor was arrested and charged with the theft of several state documents that were over 80 years old. He had been planning to move the items to a secondary location when the vibration sensor recorded his presence today. The evidence from the digital logs was a critical part of the case presented by the local district attorney. The community was relieved to know that the history of their homes and lands was once again secure in archives. Lyle continues to perform his duties with a sense of purpose that comes from knowing he made a difference. The story of the isolated church and its hidden history serves as a reminder of the value of the archives. It shows that even the most mundane data can hold the key to solving a mystery from the recent past. The machines that monitor our world are silent witnesses to the actions of the people who move through it. We may not always see the cameras or the sensors, but they are recording the truth 1 second at a time. For the residents of the valley, the stone chapel is more than just a place of quiet reflection now. The preservation of history requires the constant attention of people like Lyle Vance, who value the details of the world. He remains a dedicated officer who understands that the past is a foundation for the future of the quiet town. The record of the hidden hallway is a permanent part of the digital logs stored in the local government office. It will be there for the next generation of technicians to find when they perform their routine maintenance checks. The history of the church is written in the stone and preserved in the silent data of the sensors. In this new story, Archived Winter Patrol summaries describe a remote ski lodge where several visitors reportedly vanished during January storms across multiple decades. Officials never confirmed foul play, which left the lodge classified as a low priority site despite the strange overlap in dates. Old regional bulletins noted that each disappearance occurred within days of the first heavy snowfall, which created a pattern difficult to ignore. Ronan Kessler, a 36-year-old field technician, received a routine task on a freezing morning when his supervisor asked him to inspect abandoned power lines near that ridge. The request surprised him because the site had not appeared on maintenance schedules for years. He prepared his truck with insulated gear, his weather-worn notebook, and a sturdy radio known to survive interference. The early sky looked pale and washed out, which usually signaled an incoming storm building behind the mountains. He drove up the single-lane access road, which climbed steadily until trees vanished behind blankets of white. Drifts covered the route, which forced him to stop several times to clear ice near the wheel wells. When he reached the last turn, he saw the lodge looming through shifting snow. The structure looked crooked from years of neglect, yet fresh footprints led directly to the warped front door. That detail unsettled him because archives mentioned no active crews assigned to the lodge during winter. Ronan stepped out while the wind whipped icy flakes across the ridge. He approached the entrance slowly since the wooden deck creaked under his boots. A rusted metal sign hung sideways above the door while strands of caution tape fluttered against a railing. The smell of cold pine mixed with a faint chemical scent that reminded him of old industrial labs. He hesitated before pushing open the door, which groaned loudly under layers of ice. Inside, he found a lobby coated in dust and frost. Faded ski posters sagged from the walls, and a collapsed rental counter leaned at an awkward angle. The chemical odor strengthened, which made him breathe shallowly through his scarf. He stood still to listen for movement because abandoned structures often held unexpected hazards. The silence felt oppressive and heavy, like the lodge was absorbing sounds rather than echoing them. A sudden metallic clash rang from a far corridor, which made him tighten his grip on the flashlight. Snow blew through a cracked window, adding a restless whisper to the emptiness. He said quietly, "Hello," while hoping to flush out any squatters. No answer came, which increased his concern. He walked toward the noise with careful steps because uneven floors hid under piles of broken plaster. Halfway down the corridor, he found a steel grate leaning against the wall. Its weight and finish did not match the lodge design, which suggested someone installed it recently. Behind it, he saw a narrow maintenance stairwell missing from old blueprints. He documented the discovery with several photos, then stepped back because the chemical smell grew overwhelming near the stairwell opening. Steam-like condensation rose upward, which felt too warm for an abandoned building in deep winter. Ronan returned to the main corridor and entered a storage room where the door hung crooked on a single hinge. A tripod stood in the center of the room with a camera aimed at a roughly cut hole in the wall. Dust covered everything except the lens, which shone clean in his flashlight beam. The battery compartment sat empty, which suggested deliberate removal. He wrote a quick note in his book about the setup because the arrangement looked designed rather than accidental. A heavy thump sounded from the upper floor, which shook loose frost from exposed rafters. Ronan flinched, then steadied himself before climbing the staircase. The wooden steps bowed under his weight, which forced him to test each board before moving forward. On the landing, he discovered rooms stripped nearly to their frames. One room held several winter jackets arranged neatly along a wall. The jackets looked too new for the lodge and showed no signs of mold, which indicated they had not been here long. He checked a tag that matched a model released only a few years earlier. Near a toppled dresser, he found an emergency service patch tucked between floorboards. The fabric looked clean, which meant someone had dropped it recently. He placed it inside an evidence envelope because the detail felt too important to ignore. Outside the window, he saw the storm intensify until the sky turned white. Snowfall thickened to the point that distant tree lines disappeared. Ronan followed smaller footprints leading toward the lounge where skylight glass had collapsed into hardened ice. The prints cut through drifts before stopping at a kitchen door. He opened it and found a metal table dragged across the floor, leaving long scrape marks. Beneath the table, a wooden hatch stood open, which revealed a stairwell carved into darkness. The chemical smell rushed outward with surprising force, which made him recoil. A faint cough drifted up from the stairwell, which made him freeze. He whispered, "I hear you," and waited. A weak voice answered with a strained plea for help. He descended cautiously because unstable structures could collapse unexpectedly. At the bottom, he found a basement lined with insulation sheets arranged almost like padding. Several portable heaters stood unplugged yet positioned in a deliberate pattern. A pulley system hung overhead with ropes stretched tightly across beams. Behind a crate, he found a woman in her early 20s slumped against the wall with frostbitten fingers and a torn parka. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain what happened. She and a friend entered the lodge 2 days earlier when they were caught in a sudden storm. They heard machinery deeper inside and approached it, believing it might lead to shelter. She remembered stepping on a section of floor that dropped suddenly, which sent her falling into the basement while her friend tried to pull her up. She lost consciousness shortly afterward. Ronan checked her pulse, which felt weak yet steady. He guided her to sit upright against a crate, then searched for signs of the missing friend. Near the pulley system, he found boot impressions similar to the prints upstairs. Scratch marks lined a wooden frame that hid a recessed pressure plate. Someone had tried to pry open the frame using a flat tool. He moved the frame aside with effort, which revealed the plate covered in dust except for a single clean fingerprint. When he pressed the plate lightly, a loud click came from the ceiling, which sounded like a mechanical trigger resetting. He realized the lodge had been altered with a system of hidden traps that responded to pressure changes and weight distribution. The craftsmanship required knowledge beyond casual tinkering. Someone built these modifications intentionally and likely over several winters. A sudden crack from above signaled the hatch beginning to close under its own power. Ronan grabbed the woman and hurried up the stairs as the door slammed shut behind them. The echo vibrated through the corridor, which reminded him of controlled mechanisms, not typical decay. They entered the kitchen where the room groaned under storm pressure. The wind roared through broken vents, which matched the earlier warm draft rising from the stairwell. In the lobby, he noticed the steel grate along the hallway beginning to slide across the floor. The movement looked unnatural because no visible motor powered it. He rushed forward while supporting the woman and jammed a fallen ski pole under the grate, which slowed its closing. They slipped past into the snow as the grate clanged shut behind them with finality. Outside, the storm battered them with bursts of icy wind. Ronan wrapped her in a heavy blanket and secured her in the truck before starting the engine. The wheels spun until they caught traction along the icy path. The descent took hours, while visibility dropped to almost nothing. The constant drum of sleet against the windshield nearly drowned out the woman's occasional murmurs. They reached a ranger station before midnight, where medics treated her for exposure. She offered fragmented details about clicking noises and shifting floors. Investigators interviewed her over several days, though her memory blurred around the moment the floor collapsed. She insisted she heard breathing near the walls during the hours before she fell. When authorities reached the lodge several days later, they found much of the mechanical system dismantled. The pulley framework remained, though the ropes were cut and several gears removed. Inspectors noted inconsistent footprints around the stairwell, suggesting someone visited after Ronan escaped. The jackets in the upper room had vanished, and the tripod camera was gone, along with the clean lens. Ronan accompanied a second team to verify details in his original report. The lodge interior looked different from his earlier visit, which unsettled him. Several rooms had collapsed ceilings that were intact days before. Marks on the floor that once indicated mechanical movement now appeared faint or replaced with scattered debris. Only the pressure plate remained unchanged, though it now sat covered with a fine layer of frost. Later analysis of regional utility files uncovered an unregistered service request from a contractor using a false company name. The request dated back many winters and mentioned delivery of specialized metal components to a site matching the lodge's coordinates. Investigators never traced the contractor despite repeated attempts. During a follow-up search, rangers found an old sled buried under several feet of snow behind the building. The sled carried fragments of rope identical to fibers in the basement pulley system. They also discovered a rusted metal frame with adjustable weights similar to early counterbalance prototypes used in training facilities many decades earlier. Ronan provided additional notes describing temperature shifts he felt inside the lodge, which suggested hidden vents still operated despite no visible power source. Technicians checked for backup generators but found none. They concluded that stored mechanical energy might have powered some of the systems, though no clear explanation emerged. The missing hiker eventually recovered enough to share more details. They remembered hearing rhythmic knocking sounds shortly before becoming separated. They believed the sound came from within the walls, though investigators could not confirm it. The hiker recalled climbing through a tight service gap before blacking out on the ridge, which explained their location when found. Local residents discussed the incident throughout the season. Some believed the lodge served as a clandestine workshop for an unknown engineer fascinated with pressure-triggered traps. Others suspected the place was used as a winter hideout by someone who did not want company. A few claimed older generations whispered about strange noises near that ridge long before the lodge existed. Ronan avoided the site after his final visit because every clue pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than random decay. The combination of warm drafts, shifting floors, and automated grates suggested a creator who still visited during heavy storms. He often replayed the moment the grate moved by itself, which convinced him the system remained active even after partial dismantling. Authorities secured the area with new barriers and updated warnings. The lodge still stands, buried under January snow. Windows rattle during storms, which gives the building a faint pulse, like a living thing adjusting to winter pressure. Those who approach claim the lodge feels watchful. The basement stairwell remains the most disturbing feature because even sealed doors cannot hide the subtle warmth drifting upward long after all mechanisms supposedly stopped. Ronan believes someone mastered the rhythm of storms and used the lodge to test ideas during the quietest nights. The deeper truth remains locked within those walls, where sound, machinery, and winter silence blend into something quietly waiting for the next January visitor who wanders too close to a place that never fully lets go of its secrets. The final radio check from a remote mountain pass. Search and rescue logs from the winter of 1988 contain a series of confusing entries regarding a high-altitude pass. These internal documents describe a situation where physical evidence simply vanished into the thin air of the northern wilderness. Gideon Vance was a 54-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who spent his summers repairing remote cellular tower generators. He was a man of few words who preferred the isolation of the high country to the noise of the city. Gideon lived in a small cabin on the edge of the national forest and kept his truck in perfect working order. One frigid morning in November, he received a call to check a failing backup battery system at the Summit Pass. The drive usually took 4 hours through winding dirt roads that were now covered in a thick layer of fresh snow. He packed his heavy tool bag and checked his two-way radio to ensure he could stay in contact with dispatch. Gideon pulled his four-wheel drive truck onto the logging road and noticed the sky was turning a dark shade of charcoal. He reported his departure to the base operator and mentioned that the wind was starting to pick up near the timberline. A loud static burst from his dashboard radio made him reach for the volume knob as he climbed the steep grade. He listened closely, but the sound was not coming from the dispatcher or any other authorized frequency in the mountain range. Gideon pulled over to the side of the road and adjusted the antenna to get a better signal from the valley. He heard a faint, rhythmic tapping that sounded like someone was hitting a metal pipe with a heavy wrench or hammer. The mechanic decided to step outside to see if the noise was coming from his own engine or the nearby trees. The mountain pass was completely silent, except for the sound of his own breathing in the cold and biting mountain air. He looked toward the jagged peaks and noticed that the clouds were swirling in a way that looked almost like smoke. Gideon got back into the warm cab of his truck and realized that his radio was still transmitting a heavy signal. He picked up the microphone and asked if anyone was on the channel, but the only response was the strange tapping. The tapping on the radio changed into a low-frequency hum that made the plastic dashboard of his truck vibrate softly. Gideon checked the battery voltage on his diagnostic equipment, but the readings remained steady despite the strange interference on the air. He knew that his equipment was rated for extreme weather and should not be reacting to a simple mountain winter storm. The hum on the radio stopped abruptly, and a voice began to recite a series of six-digit geographic coordinates. Gideon grabbed a notepad from the glove box and started writing down the numbers as they were spoken by the voice. He looked at his topographic map and realized the coordinates were pointing to a location exactly 2 miles ahead of him. The mechanic put the truck in gear and slowly drove toward the coordinates while the voice continued to repeat the numbers. He rounded a sharp corner and saw a silver utility van parked in the middle of the narrow and snowy road. The van was covered in a thick layer of frost and appeared to have been sitting in the pass for weeks. Gideon stopped his truck and walked toward the vehicle with a sense of caution that he had developed over many years. He looked through the passenger window and saw that the interior of the van was completely stripped of its original seats. The back of the van was filled with large racks of recording equipment that were glowing with soft green and blue lights. Gideon noticed a heavy black cable running from the van into a deep hole that had been drilled into the rock. He followed the cable to the edge of the cliff and saw that it descended into the dark and foggy canyon. A sudden movement in the driver's seat made him jump back and reach for the heavy flashlight on his work belt. The man in the driver's seat was wearing a thick parka and held a radio microphone in his gloved right hand. Gideon knocked on the glass and asked the man if he needed any help with his vehicle or his radio gear. The man did not move or blink his eyes as he continued to stare straight ahead at the snowy mountain peaks. Gideon opened the door and realized that the figure in the seat was not a person, but a lifelike plastic mannequin. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him as he looked at the intricate wiring connected to the mannequin's head. The recording equipment in the back of the van started to spin, and a high-pitched squeal filled the small space. Gideon reached for the main power switch to stop the noise, but the metal casing was too hot to touch safely. He heard his own voice coming from the speakers in the van describing his departure from the cabin that very morning. The recording was playing back the exact words he had spoken to the dispatcher only 3 hours earlier in the day. He scrambled out of the van and ran back to his truck as the wind began to howl through the pass. Gideon grabbed his radio and tried to call the base station to report the strange vehicle and the automated recording gear. The radio in his truck was dead, and the display screen was cracked as if it had been hit with force. He looked at the silver van and saw that the lights inside were now flashing in a rapid and erratic pattern. Gideon slammed the truck into reverse and backed away from the site until he found a spot wide enough to turn. He drove down the mountain at a dangerous speed and did not stop until he reached the ranger station at the base. The mechanic ran inside and told the duty officer that there was a strange van broadcasting private signals at the summit. The ranger looked at the logs and told Gideon that the road had been closed for 3 days due to ice. The ranger agreed to follow Gideon back up the mountain pass to see the vehicle and the suspicious electronic recording equipment. They drove for an hour through the deepening snow, but they found the road to be completely empty and undisturbed ahead. There were no tire tracks in the fresh powder, and the silver utility van was nowhere to be found near the cliff. Gideon showed the officer the spot where he had parked, but the snow was smooth and white without any marks. They walked to the edge of the cliff, but there was no hole in the rock and no black cable. The ranger told Gideon that the thin air and the cold must have caused him to experience a brief hallucination. Gideon reached into his pocket to find the notepad with the coordinates he had written down during the strange radio event. The paper was in his hand, but the ink had faded into a series of blurry gray smudges that were illegible. He tried to explain that he had heard his own voice on the recording, but the ranger was already walking away. Gideon went home and sat in his quiet cabin while he listened to the silence of the woods outside his window. He turned on his home radio and searched the frequencies until he found the channel he had used that cold morning. There was nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint tapping of a metal pipe against a heavy frame. He realized that the coordinates he had followed were not for a physical location, but for a specific point in time. Gideon never returned to the mountain pass and sold his truck to a local scrapyard a few weeks after that. The cellular company investigated the battery failure at the summit and found that the equipment was in perfect working order. No silver van was ever registered in the county, and no reports of missing mannequins were filed with the state police. The records from that day were filed under miscellaneous interference and were eventually destroyed to make room for new digital files. Gideon Vance lived the rest of his life in the valley and never spoke of the mountain pass to anyone again. Some things that happen in the high country are meant to stay there among the rocks in the freezing winter air. The final radio check from that day remains a mystery that the wilderness has chosen to keep for itself forever.